Hello, I'm Rachel, and welcome to my reflection on my field experience. I chose to teach a lesson in a local Catholic school where they have just under 100 students enrolled in grades 3K through 5. There's only one teacher per grade, and in the second grade classroom where I was placed, there were 11 students who had no learning disabilities and were all good critical thinkers with a love for learning. Knowing the learning ability of students and how many students are in the class and what their overall attitude in school is beneficial for planning lessons. These 11 second grade students all work well together, have a positive learning attitude, and they're good critical thinkers. And there are no students in this grade level who have any kind of learning disabilities, which is important to know for lesson planning because it can affect the speed at which the lesson is taught, as well as any teaching or activity differentiations that might be needed. The standards are for measurement. The tools used were rulers, yardsticks, meter sticks, and tape measures. The objective was for students to use these tools correctly and record the data produced by their tool, estimate, measurement, and label. I chose to use the small activity group for a formative assessment that showed that they understood and could execute the objective. I have several examples of my students being engaged in their learning. The first is the choral reading. When reading out of the workbook, they just read what number 2 was together. The second is an example of a natural critical thinking abilities of the students in this classroom. This was very surprising because the students asked the question while I was giving them a little bit of think time. There was a question about a car that they had to measure and what tool would you use to measure this car? And one of the students asked, well, is it a toy car or is it a real car? And that was not in the book. So that was really neat to be able to witness that. The third one shows an example of students that when they clapped out the syllables in a couple of math terms as I attempted to add that piece of literacy to the math lesson. And the last one, the student's favorite part of the activity was the school hallway measurement. This was the last activity that we did, and I had my 200-foot tape measure. And all the kids were really impressed with that. It was something new and different for them, and everyone was engaged in that learning. So we took that tape measure out into the hallway, and I did a little bit of explaining with them, and then like 2 or 3 of the students took one end of the tape measure and pulled it all the way to the other end of the hallway. And then the other group of students read the number that was on the tape measure, and it ended up being 115 feet long. So they were super excited about that. There are some changes that I would make if I ever taught this lesson again in the future due to things that the students said and what their actions were. For this class, the critical thinking and deeper thought process was natural. When going through the workbook questions, one of them asked about measuring that car, but it didn't say what kind of car. The students were the ones who asked without being prompted if they should measure a toy car or a real one. So this led to some very meaningful classroom discussion, and it was great to see the students completely comfortable and engaged with that. The second thing that I would make sure to do is incorporate modeling into every detail of learning in which the students will have to show competency. I forgot to do this on estimating and on using the yardstick and the tape measure. I did it for the ruler, but for some reason I forgot the rest. As a change, I would make notes to ensure that this takes place, including using the first example of the independent or small group activity that I had for them. I would use them as a whole class modeling opportunities as that example and have us do all of those parts together. I would also be more mindful of when to limit choices. For the small group activity planned, I had the kids work together and collaborate on 3 that they would pick to estimate and measure. But this did not turn out so well because all the groups chose 2 things that would be measured, and they were all with a ruler. There was nothing with a yardstick or a tape measure, and some of the same things on the sheet were being measured by multiple groups instead of being spread out around the room. So assigning which groups were going to measure what items and choosing one item to be measured with each kind of tool would have been much more beneficial in this case for the students. The changes that I would make are based on best practices and the science of reading, which shows that students benefit from limits, modeling, and critical thinking questions. These are critical for clear, concise, systematic instruction, which is critical for student learning, so they have a firm foundation on which to build those additional learning skills. I really like it when students are engaged in discussion that utilize their critical thinking skills, and that's a strength of mine to just make sure that we have some of that incorporated into instruction. I am also not afraid to ask questions. If I don't know something, I'm looking for ways to improve something, I have no problem asking for help. I like to make sure that the kids are engaged and active in their learning because that activity helps them retain that information and use it in other learning lessons or areas. I also try to focus on keeping a positive learning environment for students where their confidence in asking questions and answering questions and participating is supported. The last thing I want is for a student to be embarrassed and because of that be too afraid to continue participating in class. Another strength I have is my ability to be flexible. If anything ever has to be changed, a big change needs to be made because of anything that's going on in the school day that is not was not predicted ahead of time. I know that everything does not always go according to plan. It's important to be able to smoothly roll into whatever attention needs as there's changes. I find that the more calm I am, the more calm the students will be, especially when it's a change in their structure for an unknown reason. Some things I need to work on are my minute to minute planning so there's no downtime or the students not sitting too long at their desk without moving or there's not too much movement and that there's a waste of learning time. I also need to be aware of the daily class schedule so that we're not late on things. I need to make sure, as I said on a previous slide, that I am modeling for every single step that I expect students to be able to do on their own. So they have a perfect example to go by and can practice to be able to achieve that. I will continue to work on weighing options of the right amount of limitations to set for students depending on the circumstances and assignments and objectives. A final thing that I have listed here as a need for improvement is on learning classroom technology. This can be very difficult for me, especially when I don't know how to use it or if it's not working correctly. So I tend to stick to what I know, and especially I know what works, and that I know that that can keep students from having some of the newer, very engaging learning opportunities and activities that have come out within the past few years. If a parent or anyone else asks me why it's important for students to learn about measurement, I could give them a whole list that is not limited to rulers, yardsticks, and tape measures. Measurement can build self-efficacy and spatial perception and is knowledge that is needed and used in so many areas of life, from home to work and to fun, even to eat. If you're going to cook, you need to know how to measure. When there are students who are struggling on any concept, it is very important that they receive the support that they need to be able to learn that concept. So when students don't learn, individualized help is beneficial, slowing down and doing some reteaching if necessary, and using manipulatives. These are all tools that can be used in the classroom to help students be able to achieve that learning success. Assessments are also helpful for student learning as well as helping teachers make decisions on instruction, and more involved tiers of intervention may be needed if a student is struggling, and other information can be collected to identify student need. When students have gained a concept, it is important to celebrate. A review game can always be a fun way to review concepts, even a few of them together as is appropriate. Having a few lesson plans ready ahead of time can also be beneficial. There can be arrangements of small groups by ability levels where students who need to be challenged more can extend their knowledge and build that in some deeper thinking exercises. Exit tickets can also be a very fun and quick way to revisit information that students have learned, and that's also a way to build their confidence. When they know something, teachers can use that to build student self-confidence, and several teachers have told me don't ever underestimate the use of stickers, even at the high school level. Again, this is just another way to celebrate their little successes in learning. This reflection has been very helpful in my learning. Thank you for watching.